Gables and Anne of Avonlea, the movies, and how it evolved into the series?
Well, Anne of Green Gables, the miniseries, both Anne of Green Gables and Anne of Avonlea were very successful miniseries in their own right. And someone here in Canada said to me, "Oh, there's never been a really great Canadian television series produced. You should do something like that." And I sort of thought about it for about 30 seconds and said, "Yeah, why not? That's a concept that works. Why not take that environment, that production value and everything that's gone into that, and see if it can be spun out into something else?" Being a filmmaker at heart, and less of a television series producer at that stage, I was really interested in seeing if I could make the television series medium look like a movie, and to make what would be an ongoing series, not an anthology, still have the breadth and scope of a miniseries. And so I tried to take all of the elements that I knew had worked quite favorably, and a lot of the talent that was associated with Anne of Green Gables, and to manipulate that into a television series. And I think that over the course of the show, I personally have learned a tremendous amount about what my original goal was. I wouldn't say that I succeeded in the first year, although the show was an enormous success in its first season and received all kinds of accolades and kudos and ratings and sales around the world. The show was sold immediately into 140 countries, which was a phenomenal success. But on a personal level, I still felt that the show had never really met its mark. I felt that some of the deficiencies in the show in its initial seasons had to do with a more sophisticated level of writing, more bravura performances, all the things that I feel make television worth watching. And so over the course of the show, that's been kind of a personal project of mine, to try and find the writers that I felt would be able to really rise to the occasion of coming up with superbly crafted scripts, and trying to keep a rein on directors and casts so that they were constantly meeting the expectations of the script and turning in good performances. That, believe it or not, I feel like it's almost taken 5 or 6 years to sort of allow a show like this to reach its stride. Avonlea was an immediate success in Canada. It became the highest rated television series to ever air on Canadian television. And on the Disney Channel, the catch-up happened later. People seemed to kind of fall in love with the show maybe season 3. So from my point of view, I was intrigued by that because I felt, okay, that show is starting to seed itself now. It's really starting to grow and become interesting. The characters themselves were defined by the personalities of the actors as much as the persona that the writers had tried to invest in those characters. And it became a very symbiotic relationship, how the writer worked with the performer. That was very intriguing because at that point I felt that the two mediums, performance and writing, had started to really combine and take off. Writers weren't writing Lucy Maud Montgomery anymore, they were writing for the performers. And that was an interesting transition, to go from a literary-based body of work into something that is, as all television series are, written for the performers who breathe life and breath into them, and that the audience wants to return and watch each week.
Right. Talk just a little bit more about how it started out being based on the Lucy Maud Montgomery books, and how it's kind of evolved from there, and the storylines have
Right.
branched off.
Well, originally, the concept of Avonlea was to base it on further literary works by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Montgomery wrote 20-odd books in addition to the Anne series. She wrote 2 books called The Story Girl and The Golden Road, which were about a different family living on Prince Edward Island and a different set of characters, Sarah Stanley being one of them. She also wrote books called Chronicles of Avonlea and Further Chronicles of Avonlea that had to do with many of the characters that were originally in Anne of Green Gables. So we acquired all of those books, threw them into a melting pot, took all the characters and an environment, basically, and then used a few storylines that were in those books to define stories within our opening season. After that, the literary material was quickly used up, and we were very soon writing for our performers and writing for situations that we ourselves as a group of writers were creating. And it's at that point that I think maybe my influence on the show was probably at its most challenging, and took the most amount of time to get the results that I'd always expected, because I wanted a show that sounded and looked and felt as though it had been written by Montgomery, but at the same time it had to reach a contemporary television audience. I'd managed to do that very successfully with the miniseries, but I think, as I said before, it took almost 5 years to do it. I feel quite successfully now with the body of writers that we've been working with, and it all has to do with style and taste and things that are very subjective. But what you're ultimately trying to do is create stories that will both enlighten and entertain an audience, and move them, and make them realize something about their own lives. And I think if you can communicate that in a seamless way, that an audience is affected by the lives of the people that they watch on screen, by the total production value, if you're able to do that in a seamless way where they don't realize how deeply they're being affected by it, then you've hopefully achieved something in the medium that you're working in.
What did you set out in the beginning to achieve with the look of the show and the look of the miniseries? They have such a distinctive, beautiful, the cinematography and just the lighting, and the whole look of the show is so beautiful. How do you
Well, thank you.
that?
The look of the show and the production values associated with it were always something that, as I said before, I wanted to see if I could make a television series look like a movie. And I think that's been one of the things that has certainly made audiences stick with this show. I think the performances and I think the characters themselves have caused audiences to want to tune in each week. I now feel like the writing is at a point where it's sophisticated enough that it will also challenge an audience, to challenge their emotions and hopefully enlighten them. But in terms of creating that look, the look was an attempt to portray a certain level of reality, but to also give it a kind of a storybook quality as well. So it became a very, I think because of that, a very unusual series.
Yeah. What do you think it is that gives it such a universal appeal? Because it seems, from little kids to older people and families all enjoy watching it.
I think it's because ultimately our goal is to tell stories about the human condition, stories that your average audience can relate to and that they're entertained by it. It's hard to do that in a series that is aimed at reaching a very wide audience, because you're dealing with really wide demographics. You've got to entertain children as well as entertain adults, so you have to access that audience at various different points through different characters and through different situations, through different dramatic situations. And that has not been an easy challenge, but because of that, I think it's given a tremendous diversity to the show. We've done kids shows, we've done adult shows, we've done action-adventure shows, as well as very serious, gripping drama. And sometimes we've done shows that explore the supernatural even, they're ghost stories. It's had a very, very eclectic and well-rounded upbringing, I think. And because of that, I think it's kept the show fresh. I've never tried to follow any particular format for it. I've always allowed the writers to pitch ideas that they were passionate about, stories about people, about our people, that reflected the human condition, that would hopefully move an audience. And our writers now, the people who have worked on this show for years, still get very, very passionate about their ideas and allow themselves to be moved in the writing process. And I think that's really important. So I think it's that freshness, that particular intent to not allow it to fall into any particular format that's allowed the show to have its breadth. But I think it's the stories of the human condition that make it universally appealing.
What are you most proud of when you look back over the whole life of the series now that it's going into the 7th season? What are you most proud of personally about the show?
I think over the 7-year process, I'm most proud of the fact that the show has had staying power, that it has been fresh, and that it's been always consistently appealing to the audience that we've that we're particularly writing for. And within that framework, there are certain tentpole shows that were designed to kind of reflect back on what the series is about. One of them in particular that Marlene Matthews wrote and that I worked on closely with her home movie was really meant to kind of identify why the show is meaningful to the audience. It was about Jasper making a movie about the town and how he had stumbled onto this invention that he was making for the Edison Company, and it all had to do with 20 frames versus 24 frames, what films are shot at, and a newfangled way of looking at things. And he was doing a scientific experiment where he ultimately ended up shooting great sections of the town, shooting the people in it. The people in the town laughed at him because they didn't understand what he was doing, and his movie was not a success from a technical point of view. But when he put the movie together, all of a sudden he had a body of work that reflected to the people in the town what their lives were all about. That was coupled with a story of people selling their land out in the town and the town being subject to change and Avonlea literally being obliterated from the map at a certain point, and Hetty wanting to hold on to that town. And then Hetty suddenly found his movie and found a tool to show everybody what was meaningful in their lives about the town. And to me, that was, particularly at that juncture in the series, was intentional so that the audience would be able to reflect a little bit about why they like Avonlea. It's not just the fact that it has a certain innocence about it, and yes, it has a nostalgia factor and all those things, but it's also about a place that can no longer be reached, that we as a contemporary audience in a way look for as an antidote to our daily lives. And the movie had a lot of poignancy in it, I think, because people realized all of a sudden, in a kind of a Thornton Wilder our town way, that life was passing them by, that their town was changing, and that at some point, maybe 100 years from now, people would be able to look at their town and understand what their lives were all about. So in a way, it was able to capture the fleetingness of their lives and make them feel like they were of importance and they had staying power, and that they had a specific relevance to the world at large. And in a way, that's what our series does, in a funny sort of way, in our global village. When you hear of a show like this being shot in Canada and selling in 140 countries, China, Japan, Scandinavia, all those places, we're taking our culture and the lives of these people, and we're playing them for another audience, and we're making them realize that their lives are not so different from our lives, and doing it in a kind of an innocent way.
Okay. Do you have any other favorite moments?
One of my other favorite shows that I felt was a completely different way of looking at television was a story called Memento Mori. It was a crisis in Hetty's life about her decision to be a writer or not, when her publisher basically turned her down and said, "We no longer want to publish your books." And she was faced not only with a professional crisis as to what she wanted to, whether she could exist in the world anymore, because she had never really explored anything beyond the boundaries of her own life on Prince Edward Island, and they wanted her to write about Paris and about India, and they said, "Well, what you're writing is really crummy because you've never been there." And so she was at a real sort of middle-age crisis and said, "My life is a complete failure," coupled with the fact that she had an appendicitis attack. And during the process of the operation, she fell back into parts of her own life, and those parts of her life gave relevance to where she was at that point, now at that juncture in her life. And it was done in a very kind of impressionistic way almost. It was like looking at a Manet painting at times. It was a very visually beautiful show. It had an incredible degree of poignancy. It had some rather difficult scenes, like Hetty being operated on the kitchen table. So there was high dramatics, there was a lot of emotion, there was a lot of movement back and forth in time, and it all had to work very seamlessly, almost in stream of consciousness. And I felt that in terms of manipulating what one will associate as being conventional television and manipulating it into something else, much more film-like and much more movie-like, was a very interesting experience to see that particular show work in a very sophisticated way and to still be able to hold a younger audience's attention. I use my own children as a little bit of a Geiger counter. If they bring out the crayons, I know I've lost them. But in this case, they were intrigued and they were held by the story. And I remember my mother saying at the time she was watching, she said, "Memento Mori, what's that about?" And I said, "Memento Mori is Latin for remember you must die. Remember, all of our lives all have a finite point at a certain point in our life that we cannot go beyond. So therefore, live each day to the fullest and get pleasure from, being a human being on this planet." And I think that's one of the things that the character of Hetty found during the course of that show. But it was done in a very unique way and was able to kind of put forward a certain point of view, I guess, to an audience that hopefully they embraced. The show was very well received by a lot of our viewers, and it was a very unconventional way of approaching it.
I like that episode. I thought it was good. This is my own personal question, but how did you get that look, or the part where they kind of look like paintings?
It took originally. It's funny because the script to that show was originally done in a bunch of very conventional flashbacks. We flash back here, we flash back there. I looked at the cut and said, "What the heck is this thing about?" It hadn't even tapped into where we wanted it to go. So that's a show that was completely created on the editing table. And how do we get the look? Basically through just playing around with it, trying to create a look that gave it a kind of a dreamlike appearance, but from a technical point of view, a lot of it had to do with just slowing things down and bypacking and overlaying several different things. Like we would overlay waves and stuff on top of different images, and the waves would be slowed down or sped up or different things. So there were all kinds. There was probably like 6 different techniques they used for different scenes. Snow was used in it. I think there was one funeral sequence where she remembered her mother dying, and lots of snow whirling around because it was in the winter, and you saw the earth going on the coffin. Those were all, believe it or not, those were like stock shots that we picked up from other episodes, that weren't even shot in winter. Somebody else had died in summer, but we put all that stuff together and bypacked it and tried to create a show that had sort of a Hetty point of view in her head. And it was fun because the script was one thing, the edit of the show was another thing, and it didn't work as far as I was concerned. And the final show was, to me, uplifting. When the music was added to it and when we were able to perfect those sequences. So it was a fun process because it broke every convention along the way. And yet, I remember the very first story meeting that we had when we talked about, okay, let's do a show like this where we want to get into Hetty's head and we want to create a crisis in her life, but let's make it meaningful to every person. And then what we finally ended up with in the end, it was a very enlightening process.
And Jackie was nominated for an award for that.
She was nominated for an award. Yeah, and actually I think Heather Conkey won, she won a Cable Ace Award for that particular script.
Wow, okay. Let's talk now that we're on the subject of Hetty, too, a little bit more about the individual characters, and talk about Hetty and what her place in Avonlea has been over the life of the series. And she's always kind of been the cornerstone, the person that, like I noticed in the, I think it's the final episode where she's trying to hold things together in the cannery.
Very much like the Memento Mori, or the home movie episode, that's right. Yes. Well, let's see. Hetty was not a character that was in the original Montgomery books. She was actually a male character. There was an uncle in the books that we took and decided, well, let's turn it into a female, an older spinster living with a younger spinster, the eldest in the family living with the youngest in the family, and living in a very symbiotic relationship. Neither of these two women are likely to ever marry. And we thought, well, they'll probably be at each other's throats the entire show, so there's probably some good dynamics there. That was the original concept of Hetty, and she would be the school teacher in the town. So that was another invention. That never really existed in any literary material, so we invented that aspect of the family. Then we decided that she should be the matriarch of the family, the one who rules the roost, the one who has all the opinions. And yet, because she's a female, trapped in a time when that was not necessarily a woman's prerogative or a woman's role, she was unconventional. So we really liked that unconventionality about her. Then we cast Jackie Burroughs in the part, and she brought a whole other level of style to the particular role, because I think she had a concept that it should sort of be, I don't know, she sort of approached it like Lady Bracknell or something like that, you know, like Oscar Wilde-ish. And she played the part, in my mind, way over the top. But she became such a distinctive character, and audiences embraced her. She was playing the role much differently than I had envisaged it in the beginning. But that was her way with it, and she's a very accomplished actor, and that was the cap that she'd set for herself, right down to the style of her hair, which she wanted to look like this, you know, helmet.